All right, great. Welcome everyone to today's Policy and Power series, which is a forum by which we bring together regulators, policymakers, with investors and founders, like a lot of you on the call, who are building a resilient and future-ready power system. Today, we are honored to be joined by Commissioner Ann Rendahl of the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. Commissioner Rendahl has been deeply involved in grid modernization, clean energy transformation, and also consumer protection, as she also plays an important national leadership role through her work with other regulators. Commissioner Rendahl, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here.
I'm happy to be here.
We usually start these conversations by asking a very interesting question that, we kind of understand and know, but we really can't define it properly. So the question is, what, in your definition, what would you say is grid resilience? And what does it mean in practice? And how has it evolved over time?
So I will just say I'm speaking for myself and not for my colleagues or the staff of the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. And I'm also in my role as president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. I'm not speaking for my fellow commissioners, but I'm just sharing my knowledge. I've also been doing quite a bit of work on wildfire issues. So this also gives me a perspective on that. And I would say that for me, grid resilience means a grid and all of its parts or its elements that can withstand challenges or threats or quickly return to service if there's a fault or damage to the system. And some of those challenges and threats are cyber attack or a physical attack, and most recently extreme weather and natural disaster. And that can come from heat or cold, flooding, wind, wildfire, or earthquake. It also, I think, is complicated now by the complexity of the grid, the pieces and parts of the grid. And there's a variety of generation on the grid that requires more effort to make it all work together. The two-way nature of the grid with distributed energy resources, the need for greater situational awareness. There's more with the distributed energy resources if they're customer owned. The utility or whoever the grid manager is doesn't always know what's happening with those resources. And then you've got more coordination of gas and electric systems, where the electric system is more dependent on natural gas now than it has been. And the natural gas and electric systems don't always coordinate well together. So when you've got large cold systems coming in the winter, making sure it's the gas system is different than the electric system, and it operates differently, and you can't just turn it off and on like you do the electric system. So you have to be very careful how you're managing those two systems together. NERC has done a lot of work on the inverter-based resources in terms of standards to prevent, to make sure that these systems ride through events and they don't drop off to create more instability on the grid. So it's really, the grid is more complex. It's going to require more situational awareness and probably technologies to make sure that it is being monitored. You can't just set it and go. Not that that was ever the case, but I think it's more the case now that you need to really closely monitor what's happening as a grid operator. So in my role at NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, my theme this year, in addition to a 3-year theme I have with the two commissioners who are coming up behind me in the next 2 years, Judge Hudson from Virginia and Chair Sieben from Minnesota. We have a 3-year theme that's uniting regulators and harmonizing impact to make sure we can, we all have different policies and focuses in our states, but how can we make sure we're focusing and collectively acting in a way that's effective. My sub-theme for the year is advancing reliable and resilient infrastructure. So I really want to focus on these challenges that we're having, the importance of infrastructure to the grid, and the importance of ensuring the grid stays resilient, but also affordably for customers. And so it's we have our national meeting in DC in February, and we'll be talking about cyber, we'll be talking about permitting, we'll be talking about affordability, and we'll be talking about resilience and how the utilities coordinate with one another when they do have an issue that impacts the grid, like in North Carolina with the hurricanes and the floods and the fires in California, because they impact all the different utilities differently, and then they all have to rebuild differently. So I think that's how I think of resilience and the importance that regulators have. It's not just trying to review what the rates are that the utilities are trying to put in place to pay for the cost of the grid, but it's understanding the grid and understanding how it works, so that when you are reviewing filings that the companies make, and for example, for wildfire, that they want to harden the grid or they want to put in certain technologies, that you are understanding why those are important, or why maybe that's not the right technology for customers to pay for. It's maybe not the most cost effective. So those are the kinds of things. That's how I think about grid resilience, both from the bulk power grid down to the distribution system.
That's amazing. And that's definitely looking at resilience even beyond the traditional, reliability metrics that we usually use to determine if our grid is reliable or not. And you had a lot of touch points there. You talked about standards. You did mention about how you're working with other regulators to kind of think through some of these problems. And then you're also doing things around wildfire mitigation, and I believe extreme weather events. So Washington, like many other states, has seen, a change in system stress so far, at least in the last 5 years, for sure. You've had climate events, you've had a lot of Northwestern wildfires. How is the commission adapting its planning and oversight to these realities? Because beyond a price regulator, I believe the commission is also a technical regulator, which kind of thinks through about what the grid needs to have from a technical standpoint. How is the commission planning, taking all this into consideration?
So the commission, as you said, is the economic regulator, but we also have a lot of different other jobs that we do. So the utilities are required to prepare 20-year integrated resource plans, where they are looking ahead, both for a short-term 2-year sort of action plan, but going out to 20 years, what they think the resources they're going to need to meet the growth. Well, as we all know, demand forecasts have changed drastically. And so planning out 20 years is really hard. So that's why every 2 or 3 years we're looking at new integrated resource plans. There's specific requirements in our state law for how the utilities are supposed to evaluate this, including climate impacts, prioritizing certain resources, but obviously meeting reliability standards. The other thing to know about Washington is, so we are a relatively small state. There's about 7.5 million customers in the state. There are 3 investor-owned electric utilities in the state. Puget Sound Energy, which has over 1 million customers on the west side of the state. Then Avista Utilities, which has less than 1 million customers, I believe, electric customers on the east side of the state. And then Pacific Power, which serves the Yakima and Walla Walla area, as part of Pacific Power's segment in Washington, has 140 plus customers. So it's a pretty small entity. And those 3 utilities serve 45% of the customers in the state. The other 55% are served by over 60 small and large consumer-owned utilities that we don't regulate. And that includes Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, for some of the big ones, inland power. You've also got the big generators on the Columbia River. You have Chelan Public Utilities District, Grant Public Utilities District, Douglas PUD, and they have significant hydro generation. So it's an interesting mix. And because of that, we don't regulate all of the utilities in the state. So the legislature really is who is setting policy for the state to cover both the consumer-owned utilities and the investor-owned utilities. And then the Department of Commerce is responsible for adopting rules that cover the consumer-owned utilities. So when we do have new legislation, new requirements, we work together to make sure we're having some consistency in how things are adopted in the state. So the integrated resource plans are a requirement for all utilities that have more than 25,000 customers. And we review the 3 investor-owned utility plans, and we have different cycles. The utilities come in different cycles. We just reviewed a number of utility gas plans. We also do gas integrated resource planning in Washington. And the process is the staff and other interested parties work in work groups with the utility. They have integrated resource plan working groups. They get together and talk through as the company presents its plans for forecast and different options, including distributed energy resources or other resources they're thinking of putting forward. A lot of those issues are, what are their assumptions about the costs of those resources and how they might plan out as they're doing all of the analyses and the modeling. Do they have the proper assumptions for how that might fit into the plan? So that's there's a lot that goes into it, and then those plans come before the commission. We don't approve them. Some states approve those, and those become sort of the approval for various resources for the utility to put into place. So we don't approve those, but we do have, every 4 years, the utilities need to file clean energy implementation plans that are based on their IRPs, and those we do approve. And so if there are particular plans the utilities have for how they're going to meet our 100% clean plans, our 100% clean law every 4 years, then we review that. That is the Clean Energy Transformation Act. It was passed in 2019. And the utilities are required to remove coal-fired generation from their rates. And so we've done that at the end of last year. That was the utilities all have a portion of the Colstrip power plant in Montana, or did, and that they have now, Avista and Puget are no longer have ownership in that plant, and that is out of the company's rates as of the end of the year. By 2030, they have to have 80% clean or be carbon neutral. And by 2045, they're required to have 100% clean energy for their customers. Now, given the changes in demand and changes in federal policy, I think it's going to be harder for the utilities to meet those goals. And we have to also do that affordably. So when we're looking at the plans, we're going to look at, does it make sense cost effectively for customers, the different resources that they're planning? But there's also a focus in the law. They have to prioritize distributed energy resources, demand response, and clean energy when they're trying to meet these goals. So we have set requirements for the utilities when they come in with their plans to take some aggressive stands on DERs and on demand response. Washington is not part of a organized market like an RTO, but they're developing markets in Washington. So some Pacific Power is a 6-state utility, and it has committed to joining the extended day ahead market organized by CAISO. Puget Sound Energy has announced it's joining the SPP's Markets Plus. And so those markets are well underway in development, and Avista has not registered its interest. The other part of about Washington and Oregon and the Northwest in general is that there's the Bonneville Power Administration, which is a federal power marketing agency. And that they market the power from the Columbia River dams. They don't own the dams, but they own a significant amount of transmission, and they market the power from those dams. And there's a preference for public power to receive that power. So the investor-owned utilities don't have the significant benefit that the consumer-owned utilities do in the hydro generation in the state. They receive it, but not at the same rate, lower rate that the consumer-owned utilities do. And because Bonneville owns all that transmission, they're responsible for also building transmission in the region, and they haven't been doing that. And so so the utilities have not been building transmission. So now we're at a point where, to meet both the capacity needs in the state and for meeting demand, there's a real need for transmission investment in the state. And also because you could build renewables and resources, but the transmission is not there, and it's almost at capacity, so you can't add additional generation. There's a huge queue at Bonneville. So those are some of the issues we're dealing with in meeting our clean energy goals. It's an interesting place to be right now. There's a lot. There's so much going on between markets and growth and meeting our clean energy goals and how we're doing that. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, that was very, very, very insightful. Thank you so much for also giving us a landscape of the Washington electric power sector and how the IOUs provide just about 45% of electricity to customers, unlike other states where they usually are the ones providing most of the power to a lot of customers. This is very helpful. I wanted to touch on, because you did mention about how transmission auditors have not been building a lot of transmission lately, and that has started to become or add to system stress. In your opinion, why is that the case? What has led to this slowdown in building out transmission networks across, for example, the Washington region? Because this seems to be a problem that has been going on around the entire country. But in your opinion, why is that the case so far?
Well, I think for the last over 30 years, we've not had significant growth in demand. So the load has not been growing. And so there hasn't been as much of an incentive. So I would say starting about 5 years ago, a number of the utilities and other entities have been really trying to build more transmission in the region. But the way the region is structured, with Bonneville as a significant transmission owner, and the consumer and utilities obviously wanting to, the consumer and utilities wanting to reduce their costs, so they're not as supportive of transmission build, and the investor and utilities trying to figure out how best to serve their customers. They rely significantly on Bonneville. And now there's such a huge queue at Bonneville, and they're trying to figure that out and trying to do some different transmission modeling and how to manage that queue, that we're in a tough spot. And then the federal, at the start of the year, when different agencies were cutting employees, they cut a significant number of Bonneville staff that were focused on doing transmission build. They now have the authority to hire and to bring people back, but you lose a significant expertise level at Bonneville to do the transmission planning. So there's a number of external entities that are working on transmission planning in the region, trying to really focus on where's the need and how do we do it. And the states have been focused on cost allocation, because that's really our role. Like, who's going to pay for this cost? One of those dynamics is, if you have an interstate transmission line, that is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is going to determine what those rates are for the transmission line. But the states generally determine what the cost allocation is. Bonneville is not FERC jurisdictional. So FERC can't tell Bonneville how to do its, they can't, if there's a transmission line built in the region, it's the investor-owned utilities who would have to allocate the cost to their customers, because Bonneville is not subject to FERC jurisdiction, and neither are the consumer-owned utilities. So it's been one of these situations of, they know it's costly, they know it's going to be hard to build, but who's going to pay for it? And the fights over who's going to pay for it are not quite resolved. So we've been working on the cost allocation issues. We've been working on trying to get better modeling and planning for transmission and working as a region together. And there are also some private entities that are working on trying to get transmission built outside of the Bonneville purview. So that's a bit of the transmission issue.
Yeah, I just want to double down. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the huge demand increase of the last year is really putting even more of a spotlight on this.
Yes. So maybe I want to talk a little bit about regulatory innovation and thinking through what this cost allocation process would look like. I mean, you mentioned briefly about the private companies, which we call the merchant transmission companies these days, that are trying to build either inter-regional or intra-regional transmission lines. And some of them, to an extent, have an appetite for merchant risk. So not necessarily the costs of service allocation. I know that there are about 4% of transmission lines in the US that are open to merchant risk. How is the Commission looking at some of this new, not necessarily new, but much more interesting cost allocation strategies to try to get these projects built? Because it seems to be the case that there's an appetite now to take more merchant risk in building some of these assets across the country, just again because of the rising demand that we're seeing across board.
So Washington has been participating in a Western effort of state regulators and energy office staff. There's an organization called the Western Interstate Energy Board, and they bring together regulators and energy office staff and others around the West. And one of the things we've been focused on is learning about cost allocation, because we haven't done it the way other regions have. If you're an RTO, that's something you do all the time. Learning about cost allocation and learning about the options. And there's a transmission group that's been pulling things together and working with a consultant to talk about different cost allocation methodologies. And that group is coming together with a set of proposals that states can consider when and if there's transmission that is brought forward for cost allocation. And it includes, to some, it's usually who's benefiting from this. So if you have a transmission line that's going from one area to another, oftentimes the sticking point is, if you feel like you're not getting the benefits of this transmission, you're not the starting point, you're not the end point, you're sort of the flyover point. And so for states that are the flyovers, they're generally not wanting to be considered in paying the benefits. So different ways of, how do you measure the benefits? Who's being burdened, who's being benefited? And also, is there a subscription model, right? If a state, I know some states in the East Coast have used, a subscription model, in the sense that our policies, like New Jersey, our policies require that we build clean energy, and we need to build this transmission. It's due to our policies, so we're going to support that build. So there's different models along the lines of who's benefiting and how do you create that first mover and that anchor tenant opportunity to get that built.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to go back to the topic of resilience, which we're talking a little bit about when we started the conversation, especially around wildfire mitigation. I know that the Pacific Northwest usually experiences a lot of wildfires, especially in the summers, largely because of the forests activity over there. what are first of all, has this been a problem for Washington, like a serious problem in the last 5 years? And what is the commission doing to kind of think through with the utilities and maybe other technological providers, for example, the innovators who are trying to be solutions around quick detection or, new type of tripping mechanisms or new technologies around addressing wildfire mitigation? What is the commission doing, and how are they thinking about addressing this problem?
So we have been focused on this really for the last 5 years. I think since the Paradise Fire in California really opened a lot of people's eyes as to the risks. Not only the utilities being aware of the risk, but also commissions being aware of the risk and what they could do to focus the utilities on this. So we started in about 2019, 2020, asking the utilities to prepare wildfire plans similar to plans that California had required. Now, we don't have the full state structure that California has or the statutory, structure they have. So we have fewer staff and fewer resources to devote to it. But we asked the utilities to file plans with us, talking about how they are approaching this risk. And so there's a lot of communication among the utilities across the West and across the country to look at how do you do this, starting in California and now in Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, Colorado. So requiring them to file plans, and then we would have a session where we would sit down with the utilities and talk through their plans. They'd tell us what they were doing, what they're looking to do next. We'd ask questions. We'd have other members of the state emergency management team come in and ask questions to make sure that they're addressing, how are they addressing the risk? How are they thinking about mitigating that risk? What are the technologies they're thinking about using? What are the operating practices they're thinking about using? What sort of engagement are they having with the communities that are most at risk? How are they sharing their plans for doing a public safety power shutoff? Or how are they thinking about using the fast trip reclosers on the lines to, if there is a risk? How are they using other fault sensing technologies? What are they doing to harden the grid with covered conductor or undergrounding or covered poles? A lot of utilities now use cameras or different vegetation management tools, combining AI. There's a number of different companies out there that use a combination of sort of sensing and cameras and AI to sort of not only identify what the current risk is, but compare over time using weather monitoring and situational awareness tools so that they can see what's happening quickly and respond. Those are some of the things we've been doing and really trying to make sure the utilities stay active. We now have new legislation. A few years ago, all the utilities are now required to have wildfire plans. We are the ones who review the wildfire plans for the investor-owned utilities, and our Department of Natural Resources looks at the plans for the consumer-owned utilities. We have new legislation from last year where we actually need to approve the utilities plans, and we're working on a rulemaking on that. For those of you that are interested, NARUC has been working on a wildfire workbook over the last year. If you look at NARUC's website under the core, I think it's core topics and then critical infrastructure, we're almost done publishing this workbook. It's in 7 chapters, and it's sort of a virtual book. You can flip the pages, and it talks through all these topics, and it links to various wildfire plans, various papers or analyses of wildfire. The Pacific Northwest National Labs has done a database of wildfire plans from across the country. So we're using this tool to help educate regulators and anyone, state officials on the risks, the financial risks of wildfire, and then various mitigation techniques and what different utilities are doing to respond. So we know it's a national issue. It's not just a Western issue. But there's also information about technologies that are being used. And there's been quite a few technologies that have been developed and are really helping both for the monitoring, situational awareness, early alerting, and then the AI modeling of, how is it changing, looking at weather forecasting. So there's a lot out there on wildfire, and we've been in the state, we're working on it, and nationally working on it as well.
Thank you so much. It was very, very helpful, and that'll be very helpful to some of the members of the audience too. So I wanted to go back to when we were talking about how the commission is thinking about meeting the 2030 greenhouse gas neutral goals, and also meeting the 2045 clean energy goals, specifically around the use of demand response and distributed energy resources. I know in the past that this has been a battle between the utilities and some of the vendor providers for demand response or distributed energy resources. So largely because the West has not been part of an organized market for almost forever, basically. Some of these technologies have a harder hurdle to get into the market, and the incumbents in the West are much stronger than, for example, those that were part of organized markets where the RTO could require certain types of technologies to be part of its product stack. How is the commission thinking about third-party vendors who provide DERs, who provide microgrid technologies, who provide demand response solutions? And how has how the utilities been taking that, and how the commission been managing that relationship so far?
So as you said, I mean, the utilities in Washington are still, I think, on their journey to trying to figure out demand response, because we aren't in a market. FERC Order 2222, which requires aggregated demand, really isn't in play. The utilities in Washington are not required to file their Order 2222 plans. But there is innovation going on. We've required the utilities, both in their IRPs, to when the utilities file an IRP and it shows that they have a need for resources, we are pushing them to not only put out an RFP for what you might think of traditional generation resources, but also RFPs for demand response and for distributed energy resources. We're also doing that in their clean energy transformation plans. Utilities, I would say, focusing mostly on Avista and PSC, have been working on demand response plans. I would say I think they're still learning how they work and learning how to work with third parties, ensuring that the data, I think the data sharing is one of those issues. The different systems that utilities and third parties use and how they talk to one another, that's really a technology issue. So those are some of the issues I think that they're seeing. We have asked them to do more. Each time they come in, we ask them to do more than they're currently doing on demand response and DERs. Puget had a time of use pilot along with a demand response pilot, and I think they're still working through the details and how they can improve that. I know they have a virtual power plant program in place at Puget Sound Energy, and Avista has done similar work. We don't have, so if you think about California and the price signals that they have, there's not the same price signals here in Washington and Northwest, where prices have traditionally been lower, and so there's not as much of a price incentive for customers to think about demand response. Something was tried about 20 years ago and it really didn't work well because there was no incentive for customers to do so. But I think as prices are rising and customers have an incentive to reduce their bills, there's more programs and more technology available. I think we could do more in coordinating with making the utilities work with third-party providers instead of trying to do it all themselves. I think that tends to be the rub, is the utilities want to develop these programs and they want them to be their programs. But I think there's enough opportunity out there to partner, and the utilities are beginning to do that and beginning to learn how to work with the third parties and benefit. I mean, they started doing it years ago with energy efficiency using O-Power and other third parties. So it's not like they don't know how to use third parties and work with third parties, but there's more. I think there's more we can do, and there's more we can learn from other states who've had effective coordination with third parties.
Okay, thank you so much. That's very helpful. So I want to talk a little bit about the rising large loads, and especially AI and data centers, and how that has been affecting many states across the country, that we're starting to see different kinds of new contractual agreements being set up and regulators grappling with protecting customers, but also providing service to these data centers in a way by which, okay, they take some of the risk and that burden doesn't fall on ratepayers. And if, for example, this demand is not real, which could potentially happen, who's going to be left holding the bag? How has Washington been affected by this so far, and how is the commission dealing with some of these challenges?
So the investor-owned utilities have not seen the kind of demand from data centers, but their demands are rising because of vehicle electrification, building electrification, some onshoring of industry. I think we'll begin to see some of the push from data centers, but that primarily, a lot of the data center growth has been happening in the consumer-owned utility territory, particularly those that own their own hydro and had excess capacity to share. So it's low cost, it's in a rural area. So that's where most of the data center growth has happened up to this point, both in Washington and in Oregon, although now Oregon is seeing some data center growth near the Portland area. So it's, so we are not on the leading edge here, but Virginia, Arizona, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, there's a number of states that are, Georgia, are seeing this and have been developing what I would call some model tariffs that can be used. I know some of the hyperscalers also have their own sort of model tariffs that they bring in, because I think there's been more pushback in the last few months about the cost that customers might end up bearing. And so there's a real focus on trying to make sure that core customers are not bearing the cost of data centers when they connect to the grid. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has just issued an order related to co-locating facilities in the Pennsylvania, in the PJM territory. I think there's some, so they recognize though that the states have the responsibility for managing the resource adequacy and the siting and the cost allocation. And so ensuring that whatever they do does not impact the state's role. And so making sure the grid is reliable and costs are not shifted to retail customers. That said, there's still some terms and conditions in these large load agreements that will ensure that the data centers don't shift this cost And the data centers, I think, are also getting more flexible. Initially, when they came in, if you mentioned, well, could you, be flexible or curtail your load, and they'd say, no, we're going to go elsewhere. And now, because they just simply need power, I think data centers are becoming more open to signing agreements that are based on how they can flexibly use the load. And there's folks like Emerald AI who have been looking at different programs on how to make that flexibility work and respond to the demand signals from the utility or from the market. So I think there's some maturity going on that Washington will eventually benefit from when our investor-owned utilities decide to, entertain data center growth. The state legislature is likely considering some data center bills this year to think about how to approach that. And there was a governor's task force on data centers to think about how to avoid imposing those costs on customers. So there is activity going on in Washington, but we haven't faced it directly yet.
Okay. Thanks for that. Going to the final couple questions left. So we do have founders and innovators on this call listening, and for a lot of us who are trained as engineers, we really don't have experience engaging with the commission. So we would like to know, how can this new age of companies like the Emerald AIs, the grid IQs who are trying to build solutions that could benefit the grid, how do they engage? Or how does engagement or early engagement with the commission look like in general? And this could be specific to the Washington UTC or just the general energy regulatory framework across the United States.
Right. So states, when they are considering, so the utilities have the responsibility of making sure they have enough resources and they have enough infrastructure to serve customers, whoever those customers are. The regulators, our responsibility is making sure that whatever the rates that the companies charge are fair, just, reasonable, and then sufficient, not only they're fair, just, and reasonable for customers and the company, but also sufficient for the utility to be able to continue providing service and then have the opportunity to earn a reasonable return on their investments. So that's the basic core structure of utility regulation. There might be other priorities that different states put in place around clean energy or other things, but that's the core responsibility that we have. So we are not the ones operating the grid. We are not the ones determining what resources to purchase or invest in, but we review what the utilities do and figure out whether we think that's reasonable or prudent for customers to bear the cost of. So that's essentially the relationship that we have. And so oftentimes I'll have folks reach out to me and say, hey, can you talk to Puget about this technology? And I say, no, that's not my role, because if I do, then potentially I have prejudged an investment, and there could be an argument that I've already predetermined that that's prudent. So we can't really get in the middle of that negotiation that innovators or technology promoters have as to what's the right investment. And we do that, as I mentioned, through the IRPs. That's when those conversations happen. And the utilities will bring forward these pilots or proposals, and we'll consider them in our cases. And they're litigated cases usually. When they come in for a rate case, it's an 11-month process in Washington. Company files testimony and exhibits, other parties respond, and then we have a hearing, and then we issue an order. So it's fairly technical. So engaging at that level, it's probably the integrated resource plans and the clean energy transformation plans, that implementation plans that the companies file. That's how you would engage with the companies on that. But the commissions are not generally going to engage in choosing a technology or not. And I would say that's pretty much true across the board for different states. But we might have workshops about a particular topic where people are welcome to come and talk about things. We're not making decisions in those kind of workshops. So if we're talking about wildfire, we're talking about DERs, or we're talking about how to meet clean energy goals, and it's not a decision point, then it's a great opportunity for people to engage and file comments and give their perspective. And we've done that on storage. We've issued policy statements on how utilities should evaluate storage and other issues. So, and electric vehicle adoption. And so we do issue policy statements, which aren't binding, but it gives us an opportunity to kind of weigh in and say what we think is important.
Okay, that's very helpful. Some states have been, I know of the decision and the policy statements. It's very helpful. So looking ahead 10 years, what do you believe would be the most significant shift in the sector over the next 5 to 10 years?
So as I said with IRPs, it's really hard to forecast out in the future what's going to happen. And, this last year or two has been such a significant shift. I don't think anybody saw this coming. So, we can plan out 10, 20 years for transmission or for resources, but really it's in sort of the 2-year cycle. So it's really hard to see what's happening. I do think wildfires and extreme weather are going to continue to be issues, and it's unless we can really harden the grid and prepare for it and figure out how to respond better, that's going to create more issues. So I do think the areas of grid resilience, grid hardening, I don't want to take cyber out of it. It's a constant threat. How to protect the grid from our own folks who are attacking substations and other things. So physical attacks, cybersecurity, extreme weather protection, I think we can definitely say that those are issues that are going to need to be addressed. So I think forecasts of demand for data centers too have been all over the place. And some people say they're completely overblown and some people say they're not. It really depends who you're talking to. And with energy policy changing so rapidly at the federal level, it makes it really hard to plan forward as well. But I think the states are not changing their policies. So focusing on the state level, I think is critical. But yeah, I think I do think it's about resilience. That's really where focus needs to be. And also building that infrastructure that is resilient to meet the demand that we think we're going to see.
Thank you so much. The next 10 years about resilience. So we do have about 10 more minutes, and I'd like to open up to questions. Usually we'll take 1 or 2 questions. If anyone has a question, you can go off mute and ask, or you can just type it in the chat while I ask for you.
I have a quick question I could throw in here. I'm really curious, Ann. So you spoke about kind of looking into the value that a new technology would provide for the customers, and essentially figuring out if it's worth ratepayers paying for that tech. What sort of things are you essentially looking for, evaluating to a little bit more detail? Like, say, for example, we're coming in as a innovative startup company to build more health monitoring. How do we relate that to like a customer value point or proposition?
So I think so our prudent standard looks at is there a need for this? Is there a need for the company to be pursuing this? How does the utility demonstrate benefit to customers? Is there a cost benefit analysis here? And are they continually reviewing this, making sure their board is reviewing this? So I think it's really about cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis, but what those costs and benefits are might change, over time, depending on if you're looking at an environmental, the environmental benefits, which are sometimes harder to quantify for health. So that's what I would, as you're trying to work with utility, they're going to have to demonstrate that there's value and benefit to the customers, and that the cost is worth the customers paying for. I hope that that's not maybe as specific as you want, but those are the general things we look at. And then the company is going to have to do some analysis and figure out sort of what are the benefits they're looking at? How can you quantify those benefits or not? And if you can't quantify certain benefits, how do they qualitatively impact the customer experience? We do have requirements in Washington to ensure that all customers benefit from this transition to clean energy. And there's a number of, we've been focused on what we call named communities, which are highly impacted communities and vulnerable customers, low-income customers. So focusing on benefits to them, the utilities have to demonstrate that as well.
Got it. Thank you, Ann. So to kind of do a quick follow-up, would like a weighted safety increase be something that would be evaluated as a customer benefit? Like how much safer would essentially a grid system be, and then assign like weight values to that in the decision-making process?
I think it really depends on the technology, and it really depends on what the purpose of the technology. So if you're thinking about wildfire resilience, is it reducing ignitions? Can you show it's reducing ignitions and increasing the safety to customers? And comparing that to how much it's increasing costs for customers. So those I think are some of the things we're looking at.
That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thanks, Aaron. Any other questions?
Hey, Ann, Ladio Gunabi here. Thanks for your time. I would love to get your perspective on process efficiency improvements that are possible with regard to the investment planning process that you lead at your commission and other commissions as well. One of the solutions that my company is focused on, Kutanla is my company. We build tech solutions for the energy sector, and one of our flagship solutions is called Grids, to improve essentially how rate case filings occur for all stakeholders, recognizing it's a just huge, heavily intensive process, labor-wise and resource-wise. We're trying to just see how data from historic rate cases and grid investment plans can improve how future investments take place. Not necessarily from a prediction standpoint, because we know it's hard to predict the future and all that, as you just said, but maybe at least from a perspective standpoint, as it relates to certain investment categories. We talked about wildfires, electrification, data centers, et cetera. And so I'm curious, my question is really more around access to the historic rate case data that is curated across your utility commission, for example, and how to get that and how one might leverage that. If you currently do, how you do that, and how one might think to do that in more innovative ways for a future perspective around investments that are necessary for the clean energy future we all have been talking about.
So we do have on our website, we have all of our documents from our record center. Any of the case documents are all online. And we're actually looking to update what we call our cases application. It's been around for a while now. It's not as archaic as it used to be, but they're, all of the orders and all the detail, if it's not confidential, are available on the website for all of the utility orders. Now, it's not as easy to search for. If you know the docket number, it's really easy. It's not as good if you're just looking by company, but I'm sure you can find a way to do that. So they are available. I know there are companies that are working on, for example, using AI, looking at cases from around the country and trying to help the staff or other parties evaluate a company's filing. But, looking at sort of past, sort of a history of what's happened in these cases, I'm not aware necessarily of somebody who's been doing that. We do try to improve our process. And the question now is how do we use AI to improve our processes? Is there a way to do that? But the risk is if we use AI, then we have to disclose that we're using AI in the analysis. And is that going to create a litigation risk for us if in our order we say, well, we used AI to evaluate all this? Well, that's not the legal standard for how we make our decisions. So we have to be very careful at commissions in terms of how we're using this to make sure we show we're actually reviewing the materials. And it's not the basis for our decision, but it might have assisted us in our decision as opposed to making the decision for us. So it's kind of a slippery slope right now.
No, thank you for that. That's very helpful, and that's where we're on that nexus at my company with our product, and that's why I wanted your perspective. So thank you for that.
I do know that there's commissions that are using some other AI related tools to evaluate, when a filing comes in. I do know that there are utilities that are using those. I mean, the commissions that are using those, and I'm sure utilities and the people, the interveners in the cases are probably using these tools too. So it's, we know it's out there. We know it's an issue.
Got it.
Thank you so much, Lottie, for that question. Thank you very much, Commissioner Rendahl, for your time today. We really appreciated the insights. It was really, really an insightful conversation, and I'm glad that everyone here also enjoyed it, and we had great questions. We do have a couple of this in the next couple of weeks, and I'll be sending out the updates to the group and those who are part of the email chain. But with that, I want to say thank you very much, ma'am, for today. It was really good to have you on, and definitely enjoyed the conversation.
Great, happy to be here, and I hope it was helpful.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.